My name's Jon Eckert. I'm at the Baylor Center for School Leadership, and today we're going to talk about my book, Just Teaching: Feedback, Engagement, and Well-Being for Each Student. This book was the work that came out of the last 4 years at the Center for School Leadership, where we've seen amazing things happening all over the world. And so we want to elevate the essential work that today's teachers and administrators do in schools all around the world. The book is really about three things, because teaching, when we get to the heart of it, really about, are kids well, are they engaged, and are they receiving meaningful feedback? Wisdom for growth to move them to that next step. That's not for some kids or all kids, but it's for each kid. So in the book, I start with a story from my time at the U.S. Department of Ed, where we were preparing for a meeting with teachers and administrators who were coming in from all over the country. And a senior official who had spent very little time, actually none professionally, in the classroom, said to me, "You know, John, what we need to do is we really just need to decomplexify things for educators." And I paused for a moment and I said to her, do you mean simplify? And she said, yeah, simplify, because decomplexify is not a word. So it hit me at the time that it was fairly ironic that a federal bureaucrat was complicating the word for simplify and then doing it in a way that was condescending to the people who do the amazing work that happens in classrooms every day. So I tell you that so that if you read the book and see at the beginning of each chapter is decomplexified, you know it's not me who made that word up. I do that because teachers a lot of times don't have time to read whole books right now. The needs are so great in schools that they don't have time to read through a whole book. So you can get through the book in about 3 minutes, or you can do these modules. We're going to do one module for each chapter. So today's module will really focus on chapter 1. So we'll dig into what it means to do this for each student, because ultimately when we do this for each student, feedback, engagement, and well-being, easy acronym to remember, few, that equals joy. That's why we got into education in the first place, which, as I always say, is the profession that makes all others possible, and there's great joy in that work. So here's the book in one graphic. Well-being I define as purpose-driven flourishing, and we'll talk more about what flourishing means, what it really means to flourish. And it's not what everybody thinks it means. It's also not what well-being is thought to mean in a lot of schools today. We'll talk about engagement. That'll be in another module around content consolidation, collaboration, and creation. That's when teaching really gets fun, because students become the focus, so that we can give purpose-driven wisdom for growth, and that's feedback. So the question that I have to ask you today is, what is your school best at addressing? Is it well-being? Is it engagement? Is it feedback? Because when we do those things well in the classroom, we get schools of character. So if you hit well-being well, you have schools built on love and justice, which then develop moral virtues in the adults and students in the school. Those are virtues like compassion, courage, and humility. Or is your school best at engagement? If you are, that's going to build a school of character based on humility and service that elicit civic virtues in the adults and children in a school: civility, service, citizenship. Or is it feedback that you're best at? That'll develop a school based on high levels of thinking quality and excellence, and then intellectual and performance virtues like curiosity, reflection, reasoning, resilience, confidence, and perseverance. So take a minute, just pause this right here. Take 2 minutes. Normally we'd have this timer fill in dark blue for you, but you can take as long as you want. Which school or which one of these are you best at addressing in your classroom or in your school? So take a moment, just pause right here, and figure out where you're best at addressing any of these three wedges. Well, if you didn't pause it, we're going to move on. But if you did, hopefully you got a chance to discuss with a colleague or someone that you know well where you think you fall. But here's the key to this chapter. Don't miss the trees for the forest. We always hear don't miss the forest for the trees, but we don't want to miss the trees for the forest, because each is a separate definition from all. Webster defines all as the whole quantity or extent of a particular group or thing, and each is defined as everyone. As flourishing leaders, we must first come to the realization that all and each are two completely separate terms. Now, I know this because I've been in education now for 28 years, and I started off teaching intermediate and middle grade students things like science. I went to Vanderbilt, then to the U.S. Department of Ed, and went all over the world talking about teaching quality. This is a scene from Muscat, Oman, and worked with 2 secretaries directly, and even came back and got to do some work with some former students and colleagues in the district I first started teaching in with the 3rd Secretary of Education. But what I love is teaching, and so what's drawn me back into higher education over the last 14 and a half years are my students. So these are pictures of students with names and even prayer requests that they have, because I've found what is my vocation. And so my work is sometimes hard, but it's always life-giving. Each Sunday we have students over to our house because we love living life alongside students, because, as I said, I've found my vocation. Frederick Buechner says vocation is the place where your deep gladness and the world's deep hunger meet. So if you're working in a vocation where you feel that, it completely changes the way we think about what we do. And so at Baylor, I get to serve at the Center for School Leadership, where we've, in the last year and a half, raised over $5 million to support educators all over the world. That's roughly 6,000 educators in over 20,000 schools in 50 states and 45 countries, because we have educators who are working with networks of schools. And so we say conservatively that's 4 million students that have been touched. In just the last year and a half, all those BUs that just popped up are places I've gotten to go and see this amazing work that's going on around the world. I always say I have the best job in education, because what I do is I go out and find great work happening and I get to write about it. And that's what I do. And I learn so much from what I'm seeing in classrooms all around the world. It's a tremendous blessing. So I'm going to show you a few pictures from classrooms. These are classrooms in Australia. This is a kindergarten classroom that integrates nature into the classroom so well. Was actually there on Pajama Day, amazing place of learning, where who doesn't want to go read in a space like that, or have a classroom that goes directly outside like this one does, or go to a library that looks like this, or be in a library with John Wesley quotes all over the windows, or these were the uniforms that they were wearing in Australia. I kept thinking Madeline would come walking down the hall at some point, but an amazing place to see this. And then their high schools. These are some of the spaces they had for high schools with quotes from people all over the world. Video studios like this, gyms that didn't need walls because it's so temperate, they could save on building costs. And then a pre-K through 12 school where the seniors every day go down and work with the pre-K students, building an amazing community of learners. Those pictures look like it's all about money, because those are some pretty nice looking facilities, but it's not. We went to this school in England. They didn't have money for a library, so they got an airplane fuselage where they put their books in that fuselage to become the school library. They needed a door handle, so they used a toilet paper holder in order to function as the door handle. It rains a lot in England, so instead of not letting their kids outside, they go outside, but a dad built a pegboard outside the door of the school so that all their boots could stay there, so the kids could go outside and leave the mud outside with them on those boots so that they would change into before they came in. There are amazing things happening for students all around the world, including in our Baylor classrooms. That last picture that just popped up are the undergrad students I get to teach. My favorite wall I've seen anywhere now, if you're in a public school, this is not something you can do, but in Christian schools, this is a school down in Houston where whenever a child comes to Christ in their elementary school, the kid gets to put their handprint on the wall with their name and the date, identifying the day they came to Christ, because they've recognized joy is everywhere in the profession that makes all of this possible. And the reason for that is because no other profession can compete with the spark between souls that occurs between teachers and students. This was an early childhood teacher that shared this with me years ago, and it stuck with me because it's so, so true. But how do we go from that individual relationship to schools of character? Well, in order to do that, you need individuals that are animated by the mission of what we do when we go into teaching, and so that's basically this. Schools of love, justice, humility, and service and excellence are built through joyful leadership based on truth and love. So it's joy built in truth and love. We pursue joy by abiding in truth and love. You can't have truth without love. You can't have love without truth. You need them both in order to fuel joy. Now, joy does not mean freedom from struggle, because we know that learning is productive struggle. Going all the way back to the zone of proximal development of Lev Vygotsky, we know it's where the kid can do on his or her own and what they can do when they are stretched. That's the sweet spot for learning, but ultimately joy is the fuel to struggle well. Right? Joy, again, well-being and flourishing do not mean freedom from struggle. It's the freedom to struggle well when we think about well-being and joy and what it means to flourish. But in Stephen Covey's classic demonstration from the 1990s, life can feel overwhelming if we put all the small rocks in first and then we put the big rocks in after. This is where the cover of the book comes from. But when we put the big rocks in first, then the small rocks, everything fits. However, the last few years in education, it's felt sometimes like even when we just have the big rocks, they still don't fit. So the question for you and your team is, where are you spending most of your time? Are you spending time in this exhausting column or in this life-giving column when you think, do, and get these kinds of outcomes? So take a minute to look these over and ask yourself, where do I fall on this? Again, feel free to pause and take a couple minutes to discuss with hopefully a colleague about where you spend most of your time. Are you in the exhausting column? Or are you in the life-giving column? I'll tell you, for me, I spend a lot of my time in the life-giving column for thinking because I've recognized the most essential things like feedback, engagement, and well-being can be the easiest ones because that's why I got into education in the first place. Not everything requires the extra mile. Burnout does not have to be a badge of honor, as Greg McCown says in his book Effortless, which I derived this from and adapted for educators. But sometimes I do things to make them harder. I micromanage things and I take things back that would be better done by someone else. And so that tends to lead to burnout. Now, I don't burn out, even though I will work 60 and 70-hour weeks because I love the work I do. But just because I'm not burning out doesn't mean I'm the best husband, the best father, the best friend or colleague I could be. So I really want to move in that life-giving column. But take a couple minutes and just figure out where you fall in these two columns. Moving on, the reason why we want to do this, so whether you're a believer or not, we know this from Zaretta Hammond's work in culturally responsive teaching in the brain, our minds are wired to attach to others. In fact, we have hormones that get released in our brains. These chemicals get released for different reasons. So if we're avoiding something because we've had trauma or there's stress that's being induced that's unhealthy for us, where we feel like we can't be successful, it's flight, fight, freeze, or appease. That releases cortisol in our brain. And we don't want that. But when we see that we can actually have some success, that gives us this idea that we could chase some dopamine and serotonin. So dopamine and serotonin come when we feel like, you see that Sudoku puzzle and you're like, I think I can do that. I think I can do that. Or you see a Wordle puzzle and you're drawn to it. It's like, oh, you've gotten dopamine before and you want it again. When you do that with others and you connect with someone else, that releases oxytocin, which is what happens when we attach to others, and that's what we want. So for people who don't believe that we're created, they're like, oh, this is just the way the chemicals in our brain are oriented. However, as a believer, I see that as being something more, and you see this in Scripture. So Hebrews 12:1 and 2. I always spend a lot of time in Hebrews 12:1 because I love the idea of being surrounded by a great cloud of witnesses and running a race marked out for me by throwing off things that hold me back. But it's really this verse in this part of 12:2 that kind of hit me, that as we fix our eyes on Christ, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith, here's what he did. For the joy set before him, he endured the cross. So joy is not freedom from struggle. Right? Joy is sometimes the reward for that struggle. So the harder we work for something, the deeper the joy. So if we don't give kids the opportunity to struggle, then they don't have the opportunity to experience great joy because the depth of our struggle determines the peak of our joy. Ultimately, as educators, we need to be catalysts, which are agents that provoke or speed up significant change or action without being used up. As a former middle school science teacher, this definition is really important to me because we want to come alongside good work and help it be better, and we want to do it in a sustainable way. A lot of things haven't felt sustainable over the last few years. So how do we lean into things that can work well? So the real question is, are you a crab or are you a turtle? So I've never gone crabbing, but from what I understand, crab buckets don't need lids, and here's why. Dan Duke, as a sociologist, coined this phrase crab bucket culture for elementary schools. Because what happens in an elementary school, like in a crab bucket, as one person gets elevated or they're about to get out of the crab bucket and be celebrated in some amazing way, the other crabs or the other teachers or the other administrators drag that person back down. Oh, that's just because they have the good kids, or they have that family, or the principal likes them better, or they have the good classes. And so we drag them back in. But instead of crabs, we actually want to be turtles. So turtles, when they lay their eggs by the sea in the sand, and those sea turtles need to make it to the ocean, what happens is the strongest turtles get out of their shells first. And they'll help weaker turtles crack their shells and then get out. The turtles then use their flippers to push other turtles up and out. So how do we function as turtles and not crabs? How do we keep from dragging others down and instead use our flippers to push others up and out, both for our students and for our colleagues? So what would it look like if you had a culture at your school that was filled with those turtles as opposed to the crabs? As Christians, we should be some of the best turtles in the world for what we do, because ultimately what we're trying to do is make sure that all of us is for each of us. Not for all of us, but for each. God doesn't see us as all. He sees each one of us and calls us by name. So how do we do that? So I don't know if you've had a chance to ever visit the Sequoia Redwoods in California, but they're some of the most amazing living creatures I've ever seen. And they are 2,500 years old or more. They're 300 feet tall, weigh over 6,000 tons, and yet their roots only go down 6 to 12 feet deep. Now, the reason why that's possible is their roots are interconnected. In fact, in Yosemite National Park, there are two groves that are a couple miles apart, and they believe that their roots are interconnected even across those 2 miles. So they're shallow roots, but they're interconnected roots that allow the trees to share support, nutrients, and water. And that's how they survive. So as educators, we know that we can't do this on our own. We need each other to do this well. So hopefully you're able to watch this with others. You have a mentor, you have a colleague, you have a friend, you have a school team, you have a district of people who want to do this work well, because ultimately what we're doing is growing giants. The tool at the end of the chapter will help you dig into it, and so we will discuss that more later. But this is the ultimate goal of what we're doing when we do this work well. So, as we switch to the next phase of this, know that we're going to have 7 more modules that will take you through these chapters. So hopefully this is a benefit as you pursue this noble goal of serving each student, not some or even all, but each. Sequoia Redwoods, these amazing living creatures that have been around for 2,500 years, and they have 6,000 tons, and they're over 300 feet tall, and their roots underneath the surface of the ground, they only go down 6 to 12 feet deep. So they run far and wide, but they don't go that deep. And so the question is, how do we grow giants? Certainly we have to grow giants as colleagues, but how do we grow giants in our classroom? And the question I want you to think about today is, who is the student that you struggle with connecting the most? Get that student in mind, and then I want you to think about them through 4 different lenses. The first one is, who are his or her friends? We know that friends are vitally important throughout the course of a student's academic career, but particularly in middle school and high school. We know in future chapters you'll read about engagement. One of the keys to engagement is, does each student feel that he or she has a friend at school? That's going to lead to a much higher degree of success if they feel like they have a friend, because the friend functions as the sun to these giants that we're growing. So as you think through this, Who are that student's friends that you're thinking about? So when you think about the student, do you know, does the kid have a friend at school? Do they have a group of friends? And what kind of influence and what kind of assets do they bring to that student? The next piece that's obviously going to be important to us as educators is academics. Where does this student excel? It might be in sports, it might be in the performing arts, it might be in math, science, world languages, English, but where does the student have relative strengths? Because that is going to function as the water and nutrients that gives that student what he or she needs to flourish, to become that giant that we know that the student was created to be. The next thing we need to think about is, what is the character of this student that you have in mind? What motivates him or her to show up at school? What assets does he or she bring? Because that's going to function as the soil that this giant is going to grow in. Who are they becoming? Who have they been made to be? What are some of those assets that he or she brings into your classroom? Now, closely related to that is going to be the home of the student that we're looking at. The home, we know, matters greatly because that is going to contribute culturally, that's going to contribute resilience, it's going to be the key relationships that that student is going to depend on for the social capital that he or she needs to truly flourish. And so those function as those roots. The wider and deeper those roots are, the more likely we are to grow the giant that we hope that we can grow as we walk alongside students as they become all that they were created to be.